Redfall, the looter shooter that never wanted to be, but the looter shooter Arcane fans got, whether they wanted or not. You see, Redfall wasn't just a looter shooter, whatever you want to call it, live service-like online game. It was specifically one that both fans of Arcane and Arcane themselves never wanted. And when that's the beginning of a story, you know that you're in for a ride. Developed by Arcane Studios, specifically Arcane Austin, and published by Bethesda, Redfall would launch and would get arguably the worst reception an Arcane and Bethesda title yet had gotten. Yes, even perhaps worse than Bethesda's Fallout 76. Redfall would be stuck in the mud since Inception, and that lag would become apparent for the world to see upon launch. There have been countless videos talking about Redfall, about the quality of the game, and just memes in general. But in this series, Death of a Game, we take a look at dead or dying games or companies through the use and lens of a timeline, chronicle major events, eventually culminating in various clues and pieces of evidence being obtained, which we then use for the final deduction at the end of the episode, where we solve the case. Being detectives means that we need to keep an eye out for clues as they present themselves, but don't worry, if you missed any, we will recap you at the end. While it has seemed like a long time for us to cover Redfall, the reality is the game's only come out this year, 2023, in the summer, half a year ago even, so we both have the sensation of being late and early at the same time. But let's get to the mystery. I'd like to welcome this video's sponsor, Zenless Zone Zero. From the highly acclaimed Hoyoverse, Zenless Zone Zero is Hoyoverse's new game, and has recently announced its second beta test, having previously unveiled monster updates at Gamescom and TGS. Get ready for a brand new urban action, role-playing game of unparalleled quality, and you'll be able to even enjoy it on PC, consoles, and mobile devices. In this game, you can control various unique characters, each armed with their own unique weapons and skills that give you the freedom to switch between different combat styles. Immerse yourself in this game's stylish art design and funky soundtrack, where futuristic urban vibes will meet pop culture. The blend of 2D and 3D anime aesthetics bring you jaw-dropping visual experiences. Experience the thrill of dynamic, movie-like combat that brings together captivating visuals and exhilarating action in a way that you've never seen before. Being Hoyoverse's new game, Zenless Zone Zero has a lot of hype behind it, and if you'd like the chance to test the game for yourself in closed beta, well, this is the perfect opportunity. Check out the link in the description, and make sure to register watching the video on screen for instructions, or just going to the link, clicking sign up now, making sure to click register, typing in your information, making sure you confirm your email, and sign the privacy policy and terms of service, and then hit register. And just wait. And soon enough, you'll have the chance to play Zenless Zone Zero yourself. Make sure again to check out that link in the description to check out the captivating world of ZZZ and an urban fantasy ARPG available on PC, consoles, and mobile. A new one, I might add, from Hoyoverse, Zenless Zone Zero. Thank you for sponsoring this video, Zenless Zone Zero. The story of Redfall begins back in 2018 with the beginning of the game's development. What should be remarked about is during this time, developer Arcane Studios was being tasked by publisher ZeniMax, known for Bethesda Softworks, to produce a live service shooter. The reason being that Bethesda was looking to be sold, and they saw a value add, as they say in the biz, by having one of their best game studios responsible for action shooter hits like Prey, Deathloop, and Dishonored head up the new title. Arcane Austin, Harvey Smith, and Ricardo Bear, following the critical success but commercial failure of Prey, needed to make something more broadly appealing. And not just that, but there were also claims that Bethesda was requesting microtransactions, though not explicitly. Arcane Austin is specifically the studio behind Prey, though they would also have the creative lead and designer of Dishonored working with them as well on their upcoming project, Harvey Smith. The interesting thing about the upcoming Arcane project, or well, I guess another interesting wrinkle in the story, is that Arcane would have both the creators of the old and the new Prey working on the title. Following the dissolving of Human Head Studios and other studios under Bethesda would be erected with the same members dubbed Roundhouse Studio. Roundhouse Studio was the old Prey guys, and they would be assisting the new Prey guys, Arcane Austin, on what would become the next shooter sim in the Arcane catalog. A move that would forever change gaming would take place September 21st, 2020. In a new aggressive effort to take over gaming, Microsoft was in the buying mood and was buying up companies and their IPs. Although ZeniMax was looking to sell for some time for those in the know, it was still shocking to see the words Microsoft purchases ZeniMax. This would now mean that Microsoft would have access to the powerful ZeniMax and thus the Bethesda IPs like Fallout, The Elder Scrolls, and more. like Arcane Studios, though Arcane largely operated separately. There were issues from the inception, as Arcane devs didn't even want to make a live service shooter that they were being tasked with, let alone a multiplayer one. Specifically, the fact that it was being pushed to a multiplayer was the issue, which was not Arcane's wheelhouse. Although reports said that leads Smith and Ricardo Bear were optimistic and initially excited, that excitement would wane over time as the direction seemed to weaken. References to popular AAA titles were constantly made and exchanged in hopes of influencing what would become known as Redfall. Far Cry, Borderlands with zombies, and more were used, and so a lack of identity reared its head quite early on as well. There's nothing wrong with having inspirations, but when your game's basically Far Lands with zombies, well, you have a bit of an issue. But it wasn't just the problem of the team not really wanting to make a live service game, there were also issues of Arcane being understaffed. Reportedly having under 100 employees working on a AAA shooter like Redfall, that was a smaller team for sure. Other issues would be low salaries, which means that they would struggle to attract quality developers, or keep them, with Bethesda being known for paying people lower than the industry standard. Over time, these issues would culminate in more issues, resulting in Arcane Austin losing over 70% of their Prey development team, severely hamstringing the development of Redfall before it was even publicly announced. But this would also have major ramifications for Arcane Austin in general. While these issues were ongoing, leadership kept promising that eventually the arcane magic, BioWare magic deja vu, would manifest itself. By 2021, the idea of Redfall being a live service idea was kind of scrapped, at least the monetization part of it, which meant that the entire business model and plans were also scrapped behind the scenes, including microtransactions and even a cash up with cosmetics. By June 2021, Redfall was finally publicly announced at E3, described as an open-world vampire shooter, which was actually intriguing sounding. The trailer footage showcased Redfall somewhere in between Fortnite and Far Cry, which was an interesting mix but not out of the question for being able to find some success, at least in my opinion. Things were supposed to be on schedule, but an early delay would hit May 2022, pushing the game all the way into the next year and pushing it an entire year. This was a rather significant delay, though considering all that was mentioned about the development cycle, thus far, not surprising for us. The former studio head of Arcane, Romuald Capron, and the former studio head Rafael Colantonio would depart Arcane sometime before 2022. Sorry, my French fans. Both would go on to help found or create new companies. Colantonio, most famously creating the immersive sim ARPG Weird West. I wanted to mention these two major departures because this is, well, actually quite common with major purchases of companies. Oftentimes the founders will only stick around long enough to see the sale off, and with many of them just not wanting to work with the new parent company. In gaming, this happens an overwhelming amount of the time, and my idea is that corporate structuring and loss of creative voice and control are the major culprits. Whatever the reasons are though, Arcane losing such crucial leadership wasn't going to help them going forward, and certainly not help the direction and development of Redfall. Quietly, the same Arcane team and another developer would be working on an unannounced title in August of 2022. While Arcane wanting to do multiple projects wasn't unheard of, since they were effectively doing a multiplayer shooter, the expectation was that there would be more support, more live support. Way more details were released about Redfall January 2023, such as the release date set for May 2nd. Redfall follows a group of vampire slayers as they fend off an entire town overrun by the undead. It looks set to offer exciting co-op gameplay, with each player able to customize one of the 4 characters available to help build out the team. It can be played single player too, for those looking to take on the vampire hordes alone. Redfall to the public had every chance of being the immersive sim players were used to with Arcane titles. But behind the scenes and to the watchers of this video, we all know it was just a matter of time before things just all started crashing down. Although Redfall can claim to have shedded most of its previous live service trappings, one of the previous aspects that remained was the always online aspect. Redfall, despite being playable offline and solo, would require an internet connection to play. This is why it's featured on this series, like other titles such as Marvel Avengers and Godfall. In a brilliant marketing move, I should say, Arcane would express a desire to remove this aspect, or at least backtrack on such. But this would never come to fruition. The genius part is that it's good publicity without actually having to do anything at all, since most people would just forget in the first place. What's cringe for me is Harvey Smith, Redfall's game director, trying to list logical reasons to keep the game always online, and only coming up with one. You don't have to lie to those dumb enough to not care, or even those that would even know what the issue is, but you don't have to lie, definitely, to the rest of us, buddy. The PS5 version of Redfall will be cancelled March 22nd, 2023. And besides the Kotaku article making it overly dramatic and listing it as Xbox's doing and not Microsoft to be kind of like a pedantic child in my opinion, the article was correct. The port had been cancelled, and doing such months before your launch was certainly a questionable decision, or at least a worrying one. To make matters worse, although it would launch on the Xbox console, it would launch as a 30 FPS locked version, with the Performance Edition to come at a later date. I can just hear TB rolling in his grave. But seriously, an action vampire shooter sim at 30 FPS? What a wet noodle. Redfall would launch as planned, May 2nd, 2023. What wasn't planned was the overwhelmingly negative reception. From 75 critics, which is an absurd amount of major coverage I should add, Redfall would score a horrible 56 out of 100. User scores were much worse at 3.5 out of 5. Both major outlets IGN and GameSpot, known for giving rather generous reviews, would score Redfall a horrible 4 out of 10. IGN wrote a scathing review stating that Redfall was an undercooked looter shooter by every metric. Redfall's chief problem is that it's simply not ready to be played. By the halfway mark of the story, I was already thoroughly underwhelmed by the bland missions, weak combat, and repeated technical problems I'd seen. Of course, I'd held out hope for the possibility that things would crescendo as it approached its conclusion, that an imaginative finale might make jostling with all the jank worth a Game Pass glance for vampire junkies and co-op crews. Unfortunately, it doesn't get better. If anything, it gets worse, like the delayed reaction of a knock to the crotch. GameSpot wasn't that much nicer, even being critical towards Arcane themselves. Ultimately, Redfall is a game that should not have been released yet. Its litany of bugs hampers the gameplay loop of exploring its world with friends, and that loop itself feels compromised by elements that are poorly executed and ill-suited to the team implementing them. I can't pretend to know whether Arcane chose to make a loot shooter, or was assigned to make a loot shooter, but I can tell you that it feels like one of the best game studios in the world suddenly made Toothless. Many reviewers took issue with the lackluster, or dare I say, completely non-existent story in the game. Redfall might be an interesting world idea and might even have some interesting parts to it, but the majority of the world is just empty and boring and has nothing of note to explore or experience. In fact, when you do find what few enemies populate the fictional rendition of Massachusetts, they are so dumb and forgettable, and they offer no challenge, and no reward for dispatching them. AI in Redfall might be some of the worst that I've ever seen, and the loot rewards are right there with it. All you need to do is just watch a little bit of the gameplay yourself, live even, to see for yourself. And don't get me started on the litany of bugs and technical issues that were plaguing the game, that have populated many dozens of videos and compilations at this point. To me, the worst part about Redfall was the core of the game. The looter shooter immersive sim thing was so half-baked, not even looting or doing the missions throughout the game was enjoyable. And that's the core gameplay loop that should and must be enjoyable to succeed. Literally 2 days later, there was a major report posted on Washington Post about Microsoft and Redfall being a major failure. Phil Spencer would say that we needed to improve on engaging games that are midway through production when they become a part of Xbox. We didn't do a good job early on in engaging with Arcane Austin to help them understand what it meant to be a part of Xbox and part of first party, and use of some of our internal resources to help them. Like the previous claims had stated, reportedly, Microsoft had no involvement with Redfall, and was claiming that that would not be the case going forward with acquired projects. While this might sound like a cop-out from all sources that I've seen, it's true. So if anything, it's just kind of more embarrassing that you wouldn't be checking in on the games that you just acquired. The only statistic impressive for Redfall thus far was the number 2 ranking on Game Pass, but if anything, I think it showed more of the consequence of people just not being willing to play the game or pay full price for it. I should add, that's $70 by the way. Meanwhile, the numbers on Steam were horrible. At launch, the game struggled to even get over 1,500 players peak. While Spencer never outright defends Redfall, he sort of does defend the artistic direction of the game, and the team behind it. Now, I don't think that that's inherently bad, because he's not supposed to just trash on his own company publicly anyway. But I think it does little to make those who bought into Redfall, or didn't, and are watching from the sidelines feel any better about it. Arcane ultimately had hoped that Microsoft did get involved, but perhaps not for the reasons that you might think. They actually wanted Microsoft to straight cancel the game, and this comes from many reputable sources. Redfall, even after years spent on it, wasn't even wanted by those who created it, an absolute horrible sign for any game. But it wasn't a problem that Microsoft could just fix, and most of the talent already left the company. In a total, trust me guys, this isn't early access or a rush title approach, Redfall will put out a base performance patch June 12th, 2023, that would also target the AI in the game, which for people wondering, that's not something that you should be seeing for a launch title. But at least according to job listings and journalistic theories, Arcane hadn't given up on Redfall yet, by the end of June. However, by July, there were some reports that Arcane was returning to their roots, with more rumors of hirings for a new immersive sim. While there's nothing wrong, as I already said, with Arcane making multiple games at the same time, they have to stay afloat. Anything that happened now was going to be finally combed through and magnified. Fans were wise that Arcane could possibly just try to pivot off of Redfall instead of attempting to fix it in the first place, as others have done in this series. Pete Hines, the head of publishing for Bethesda, would state that Redfall would improve eventually, comparing it to another Bethesda failure, Fallout 76. This felt incredibly tone-deaf to me, because there wasn't any actual apologizing for what was going on. If anything, Spencer was the only one that was apologetic about the entire thing, and he wasn't even involved with it. But Pete is a guy who spins things, so this is sort of a typical response from such a character. Making the game 60 FPS at this point would only solve a minuscule amount of the litany of issues that the game was plagued with. 4 months later, and no new content had been released for Redfall. And while this would be okay if the base game was good enough, and there was enough content to enjoy, there wasn't. And people were expecting a No Man's Sky level remake or redo, as they seem to always delusionally do, at this point with games that fail at a big stage. But with peak population on Steam at 48 players, something big was definitely going to happen. Redfall would finally receive its first major update, if you want to call it that, October 6th, 2023. I say major update because the only thing major really about the update was the inclusion of the performance 60 FPS mode on Xbox. Sure, they added some stealth takedowns, more enemies in the open world, and some changes to controller settings and improvements to screen narration, but these changes, despite being hyped needlessly by outlets like the one on screen, were basically just TLC updates. These were changes that could have happened months ago, as it didn't change anything significantly, and were all needed from basically the beginning. These were the kinds of updates that happened right as game developers were polishing a game to be ready for launch, not happening 5 months after launch. They did very little in the way to inspire players about what was to come, and even less to bring in any new or old players. The update would only jump up the population by 36%, and while that can sound impressive, that was only a move to 56 players peak on Steam. Not anywhere close to the kind of jump that they were going to need to remain in the news cycle, let alone be a functioning multiplayer product. Meanwhile, you could still purchase the DLC pack on Steam for Redfall, making it just an absolutely bizarre affair entirely. As of right now of this video, only days after the events of this timeline, the game is still full price. And not $50 full price, but $70 full price, making Redfall easily one of the worst value offers. Pete didn't seem to have desires to stick around and see Redfall to fruition either, as he would depart the company October 17th, 2023. Pete had been with the company for 24 years, making it another high-profile departure during the story of Redfall, though from the Bethesda executive team side of things. What I find rather interesting is not long after, it would be announced that Matt Booty, a lead executive at Xbox, would be in charge of ZeniMax and Bethesda games going forward. While these two don't have the same position, I wonder if Microsoft having more control was a factor in people like Pete Hines leaving. Regardless, from a business perspective, for Microsoft, it was a necessity, and Pete wouldn't likely be the last person to leave from Bethesda. With the music playing in the background, this mystery has come to an end. While technically Redfall is still around, that's probably news to you and most other gamers. Redfall has to be one of the biggest falls from grace for a AAA title rivaling or eclipsing even titles like Anthem. I don't see the fate of the game being anything other than negative at this point, especially with the most recent attempt or update. But if you were paying attention throughout the video or missed a clue or two, why did Redfall ultimately fail and find itself on this series? It launched clearly unfinished with tons of bugs. Uninspired in a lackluster open world. It had a repetitive and boring gameplay loop. Bethesda gave it a lot of corporate pressure, a major loss of key talent. Arcane fans and devs didn't want it. The last reason is a real killer. While it's totally awesome being a well-known developer, it also puts a super high standard on you and your games. Think about BioWare and their fall from grace, for example. But if you lose sight of what your core audience wants, you might lose your core audience altogether. And while Arcane has plenty of fans still wanting to give them another shot, as they don't have a large record of failing, making this feel more like a one-off, if they aren't careful with their next titles, they could very well compromise their amazing reputation and thus their audience, and follow in the footsteps of BioWare. Coming off the success previously of Deathloop, however, and a litany of other successful ARPG immersive sims, all signs point to being able to make another successful one. But Arcane would be lacking many of the key talent that made that happen previously, a major issue that all game development companies suffer after being acquired by a major corporation, making such a harder endeavor. Although the Arcane team felt being acquired by Bethesda was originally the right fit, they had little choice in being acquired by Microsoft, further complicating things, I'm sure. In the end, the lesson that we learn, and likely will continue to learn on this series, is that no matter how much you try to make money in art and video games, if you task your development team with something that doesn't invoke their excitement or inspirations, or even utilize their best talents, well, the final product is rarely one that's going to be remembered past the point of their failures. And another note, a side note, and probably a very personal note for myself too, is that no matter what you do, after you sell to a corporation, the outcome, historically, has basically only been one direction. Thanks for watching.